Today I'll be talking a little bit about a new project for which I've been collecting some data for a few years, and I would very much welcome your suggestions, your reactions. Because it's something that it's kind of a project that I find really interesting, but at the same time I can't really quite that I can't quite organize in the way I would like, and it still doesn't make quite full sense. So you're really going to get to see a little bit the kitchen of doing research and how it looks like when you are building up your argument and trying to develop it. So I just want to try to use, I would like to try to go back and forth with my slides, but I seem unable to do that. I don't know how, is this like that? Okay, yes. Can you see the slides and can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. If anything is unclear, let me know. So today I would like to talk to you a little bit about the notion of norm erosion in international politics, and would like to present you with some new data and some ideas I have for, this is a book project that I've been working on for a few years when I was still in Sweden, and then since I moved to France, I've had a bit of a harder time to focus and concentrate on this, but I've kept working on it, and the idea here is really to use some of the material I've been collecting over the years to try to understand, basically in a nutshell, how international norms die and how they die while still. Hello?
Hello, yes, still there.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. There is a weird noise. I don't know what it is. So basically, the idea here is to try to understand under what conditions norms, so guidelines of expected behavior, how they erode, how they become eroded in the international system, and how eventually they die. So to start us with this, I'll tell you a little bit more about the topic, and try to formulate the research question I try to ask. Then I give you some ideas of the kind of argument that I'm trying to develop. I'll delve into some methodological reflections on how I've been collecting data over the years, and then I'll give you illustration from two cases. Meaning two norms. So I'll focus on the norm of domestic deployments and the norm of search and rescue, and I'll try to show you and try to illustrate how that norm, those two norms have become eroded. And I'll spend quite a bit of time on the norm of domestic deployments because I think it's kind of a bit more interesting, perhaps, for the students in the program. So just to get us started. There seems to be a general understanding that a wealth of norms, particularly liberal norms, seems to be somehow declining. So there is a whole literature on democratic backsliding, particularly in the United States. So it seems that democratic norms are declining there. There is a whole debate within the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, on the fact that that there is the erosion of war prevention norms. To the right in the slides, you can see also in our recent report from the Commissioner for Human Rights in the European Union that seems to be denouncing also that there is a human rights erosion. And then going more to the left, there was a post that Claire Hutchinson posted on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, which I thought was really interesting. So in case you don't know her, Claire Hutchinson was the NATO Special Representative for the Gender, Peace and Security Agenda, and she was the NATO's Special Representative for until Irene Fellin kicked in just a couple of years ago. And basically, Claire Hutchinson just a few weeks ago started, did this link post saying, okay, apologies in advance, and really, apologies in advance for the rant, sorry, not sorry, with all due respect to the author, this is just not well informed. And then she goes on by saying that the Women, Peace and Security Agenda has also become eroded. So, by and large, there seems to be a bunch of norms that seems to be getting increasingly eroded, and probably this is not new, right? We have probably seen norm erosion, throughout the history of humanity. But we, when you start collecting sort of evidence of norms becoming more contested and perhaps becoming eroded, we seem to have quite a few out there at the moment. And so that then, led me to wonder, to really ask these pretty basic questions. How is it that norms erode? And in particular, how is it that they get hollowed out? So in other words, also known as, how on earth did we get here? How on earth are we getting to the fact where some pretty important norms of the international system, and particularly liberal norms, seems to be getting eroded. So I define norms as shared expectations about appropriate behavior held by a collectivity of actors. This is a definition that Jeff Jekyll used in 1999 as part of one of his publications, but my understanding of norm is based on this idea of shared expectations of appropriate behavior. But I also think of norms very much in a Durkheimian way, to really emphasize the intersubjective shared understandings and expectation of behavior within a particular community of individuals. So in general, what I'm interested in is not so much to understand whether in general norms are eroded globally, and that's not really my entry point, but my main point is to understand of those norms that seems to be eroding, how on earth were they eroded? How did they become eroded? And in particular, I'm interested in this phenomenon of norms getting hollowed out, meaning norms that formally remain in place, but that are actually completely devoid of their most fundamental meaning. And in this current project, I'm really interested in understanding what is the process through which, what are the mechanisms through which these norms become hollowed out. And the concept of hollowed out is something that I find particularly interesting, because it somehow refers to the fact that the norm remains formally what it is. So it may look as if it was still alive and well, but de facto it's not, because it's not anymore applied anymore in the same way. So in a nutshell, my focus then is really. I skipped a couple of slides. So my focus is really to try to figure out what are the micro foundations of this norm decline, and particularly this norm hollowing out. And I try to trace the trajectories of norm decline, and I've explored modalities and different types of norm decline, although I'm definitely not there yet. And I would love your views on that if you have any suggestions and thoughts. So my argument is, it's one that is blending different aspects of political science and sociology. So I think that Tony is not wrong when he says that I'm a military sociologist. I think he's absolutely right about that. But I blend that sort of sociological sensitivity with kind of an interest in institutions, as political scientists often are. So when it comes to the argument, so the thing that I'm trying to explain here is really, how do norms become hollowed out, right? So my starting point is that a norm, an international norm is, my starting point is that it needs to be somehow well anchored. So we need to have a norm that is well in place, that is, that is codified in some ways. So for instance, we can have a norm that is, is written up in a sort of in conventions and declarations, and that maybe has a set of institutions that support it. So the starting point is that one. It's kind of a necessary conditions to be able to erode. The norm needs to be there, and so the norms start getting hollowed out when there is a tension somehow between a norm and a particular situation where the norm clashes with other motives or with a critical juncture. Just to give you an example, during the migration crisis, which really started in the so-called migration crisis, which started in Europe in 2010, many argue, basically the norm norm of the obligation of searching and rescuing people at sea, was basically applied for the first time, in European context, to a very large number of people, and in a context where there was no reciprocal expectations in a way. So, the idea was that these migrants that were crossing were basically helpless. They needed to be saved because that was codified in the norm. But ultimately, the norm itself, which is very long-lasting, and I'll tell you a bit more in a few slides. But that norm was basically for the first time being applied in such different contexts, where the norm didn't rest on the principle of reciprocity, but the norm was a norm that universal norm that had to be applied to everybody in the particular context of the Mediterranean migration crisis. So that's the first important point. So there needs to be a tension between a norm and the particular situation where the norm clashes with other motives, which is something that historical institutionalists would call a critical juncture. And then to explore the process of norm hollowing out, I take a transnational polity-centered approach. So basically, I look for the locus in which discussions about the norm and how it should be applied are taking place. So in previous work with Pascal Denesson, we defined the transnational polity as the main locus of the actions carried out by politicians, by public officials, and by social groups. And basically, the point here is that we are looking for the locus, the space in which agents are likely to start talking about the norm. They start to interpret the norm, and they start discursively hollowing it out. So we are really interested in focusing on those agents within institutions, often in a hierarchical power position in relation to others. So I'm also really interested in studying how the military deals with norms, for example. So I'm not only looking at the elite level, but I'm really looking at agents in institutions when these agents are tasked with interpreting the norm in a particular way. So the idea here is that agents give meaning to situations through different forms of meaning making discourses, and then little by little they construct different interpretation of the norm. And a particularly important role here is really played by something I call anti-preneurs. So these basically norms entrepreneurs, those agents within the locus, within the space, that are starting to erode the norm on the least controversial side. So there are usually different provisions into international norms, and the entrepreneurs play a really, really important role in weakening the parts, the components of the norm that seem prima facie very benign. And this is kind of interesting if you think. Just an example for this is the example again of the norm of searching and rescuing people at sea. Because if you look at that norm, that is a universal norm that has two important provisions. The first provision is saving people, saving humans, and the second component of the norm is bring them to a place of safety. If you look at that norm erosion, at the process of erosion of that norm, that norm really started being eroded on the side of the bringing humans and people at sea to a place of safety, which is the most uncontroversial part of the norm, and the one that is the least controversial, so to say. When safety becomes a place in Libya where the EU can externalize migration policies, then you can see how the norm has become hollowed out. And I argue that these entrepreneurs play a really, really important role in kind of eroding that particular, they start eroding the norm on the side where it's easier to do so. And so importantly here, the norm then becomes little by little through discourses processes of normalization. I argue the norm becomes little by little hollowed out. But remains still in place. So the idea here with this very early stage project is to basically I don't know how to, is to make a few contributions to some important debates, international politics and also security studies. So one is to really try to think about how to bridge the micro with the macro. So by looking at very much at the micro level, I try to explore how agents at the micro level erode and normalize the norms, particularly the entrepreneurs that play a particularly important role when it comes to that. But in doing that, though, I also want to look at more macro, broad stroke historical processes that have led to the erosion of the norm. So it's a bit of a way to keep those two together. And I do so by blending discursive institutionalism with historical institutionalism. So I look at the importance of critical junctures, but then I also look at the power of discourses in making certain ideas possible, in mainstreaming certain ideas of norm erosion that would have been considered impossible just a few years before. And to do that, I use very much the meaning making. So I think of agents as producing meaning making, as making sense of their surrounding context, I also look at normalization and how agents tend to normalize the erosion of a particular norm. And I also think that, by and large, I'm really interested in how this fits into the pretty big debate, which I'm sure you're all aware of the norm life cycle in international relations. So in the 1990s, there were these constructivists like Martha Finnemore, Catherine Seeking, Michael Barnett that wrote very extensively about how norms become, how international norms become internalized and how they are implemented in domestic context. But we still do not know super much about how norms die. And so that is really quite an important contribution that this project is trying to make. So in terms of, I'll just tell you a little bit more about the cases I'm playing with and, the kinds of cases I still have, I already have data on. And so today I'll really be speaking about the first two cases you have to your left. So here, yes. Here are the four cases I'm thinking about, and I would very much welcome any suggestions of it. If you tell me, Chiara, there is one case you absolutely need to work on, I would be more than happy to consider it. But the idea here is to look at, I've been collecting quite a bit of data on the norm of searching and rescuing people at sea. So the universalistic obligation that when somebody is in trouble at sea, that human needs to be saved. So that is a very ancient norm, is one that is mentioned by Virgil and by Homer already, it's one that seems to be really quite important, and so it has a positive connotation. It says you need to save these people. So it has a high degree of institutionalization. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's a norm that is enshrined in some. It's component. It's a part of customary international law. It's part of jus cogens. There are a wealth of conventions and institutions in place to make sure that that norm is guaranteed and that there is a system whereby if you find yourself in trouble close to Malta, for instance, you will be part of a search and rescue area where you can be saved. And my focus for that, so it's a very high degree of institutionalization, and then for that particular norm, I'm focusing on the central Mediterranean route. So that route, the migration route that has, where a lot of people have died, trying to cross from Tunisia, Libya, towards Malta, Italy, towards Malta and Italy, for and foremost. And the type of hollow out that I seem to be observing when I look at the process of hollowing out is one of dehumanization, where we find little by little, and this is really drawing on Yagil Levy's work and on Judith Butler's work, on the idea of having, producing discourses that little by little show that these people that need to be saved are not worth saving, basically. The second norm that I'm focusing on is the norm it's a very different norm. It's a norm that tells us that one should not deploy the military internally within a state. So it's a very different kind of norm, a very different setting. The realm of applicability of this norm is not universal anymore, but it's very much the state. And in this particular case, the connotation of the norm is about not doing something, right? Use the military only in external functions and do not use them in domestic functions for domestic policing purposes. I would argue that norm has become eroded in several Western European countries, including the UK, I would say, but please tell me if you think I'm wrong. And so that in terms of degree of institutionalization, what I seem to find is that there is quite a high degree of institutionalization in terms of codifying that norm into some law or into some constitutional law level component for those countries that do have a constitution. I'm thinking about Germany, for instance, that has a constitutional law that prohibits the use of the military in domestic functions, but that has started to do so nonetheless. And then, so the realm of applicability here is very different. It's Western Europe, and the type of hollowing out that I observe in this particular case is one of normalization, where little by little, oftentimes on some very seemingly benign ground, for instance, maybe there's a flood, and it just seems rational. It seems to just make sense to deploy the military domestically. That norm starts getting hollowed out, and then again through a similar process, then the norm becomes hollowed out, and the effect become larger and larger. I'm thinking about these two other norms, but I won't spend time on it because I think that I need at least a third case for exploring this modality of norm hollowing out. But I'm unsure, and I would very much welcome your suggestions on that. Okay, so in terms of methods, I'll just tell you a little bit more about how I work with this idea, and then also, how I've been collecting the data that I have so far, aware of the fact that I still have quite a bit of work to do on that. So the main idea here for this particular type of work is really that I work abductively, so I work going back and forth between theory and empirics. So it all started it all started a bit accidentally and unexpectedly by collecting some data on searching and rescuing, and also some data on domestic military deployments. And then I've been reading, I've been going back to the theory, reading about state formation when it comes to the norm of domestic deployments, and reading about norm life cycles in the IR literature. And that's how I've been operating over the past few years to try to make sense of this. And in terms of actual data, I've been combining quantitative and qualitative data collection. I do have more an expertise on the qualitative side of things, but I do really like also to this longitudinal document analysis. So I've been spending clearly way too much time trying to trace back when countries started to use the military domestically for the first time, and I'm really fascinated by this. And so I've done some work on longitudinal work, but I've also done quite a bit of mostly collaborative work with Dietrich and Christinette, particularly about domestic deployments during COVID. And I put up the references in a few slides. But then after this first phase of data collection, that was mostly quantitative and really merely descriptive, I've basically been turning towards a more fieldwork kind of approach, more ethnographic kind of approach, and I've been doing quite a bit of a bit more now than 200 interviews with politicians, bureaucrats, coast guards, and other people that were in the two loci that I'm interested in. So the loci that takes decision about searching and rescuing people at sea, and the locus that takes decision about domestic deployments in some Western European countries, notably France, Germany, and Italy, which are the three countries I mostly collect data on. I've also done a little bit of ethnographic observation on some occasions. I've been on some rescue ships with Doctors Without Borders and with SOS Mediterranee, for instance, to look at how they interpreted the norms themselves. And I've spent time with the Italian Coast Guard and the Italian Navy in particular to try to figure out how they were interpreting the search and rescue norms. And I've done similar things for when it comes to domestic deployments. Okay, so let me just give you a sense of it more. Let's delve into the data, and I'll spend most of my presentation really on this first illustration, which is, I think, maybe more interesting for you, given also the focus of your master's degree. I'll conclude on the second search and rescue norm, and also give you some indication of how it works there. There seems to be growing interest and a growing use of the military in domestic functions. This seems to be the case in the US. It also seems to be the case in Western Europe. And so this part of the presentation is very much based on this earlier work that, as in very different ways, tried to look at and tried to make sense really of domestic deployments in its different forms. So the idea here is that the norm that I'm looking at is the norm that says that the military should not be deployed internally. And I think that in general, and I'm unsure whether to include I'm sure whether that's exactly the case everywhere, but by and large, in the three countries that I'm looking at, so in France, in Italy, and in Germany, it seems that the norm against using the military in domestic functions is born. We can trace its origins in the early state formation phases. State militaries should be externally focused. That's something we find both in Italy when only the Alpinis that Tony was referring to are actually those that are allowed to be on on Italy's soil, but they are purely defensive units that should be located at Italy's border, meaning on the Alpine crescent. But the same goes with France. So the idea is that by and large, state militaries should be externally focused. And if they are internally focused, like certain paramilitaries, such as the Carabinieri or the Gendarmerie, then they are under very particular regulations, and they may be under they may be considered services and part of the armed forces as well. And both the Gendarmerie and the Carabinieri are, but they are treated in a slightly different way. So with different rules and regulations that allows them that grant them bigger autonomy. So I would say that those paramilitary services falls outside the scope of this analysis. What I'm talking about I'm talking about mostly the army really, and the army and how in general the army is considered to be externally focused and focusing on external threats only. In terms of institutionalization, this idea, I find these rules and regulation as early as in the 1870s that sanction that say that by and large armies in France, in Italy, and in Germany should only be used for defending the country from external threats. And what I seem to find is that by 2020, this norm in those three countries, not only in Germany, in France, and in Italy, it seems to have become completely eroded. Because even in relation to what the regulation was, so we see variation between the two. Obviously, France is the country that has deployed, between the three, has deployed the military most. Italy has had also a pretty large domestic policing operation called Operation Safe Street, Strade Sicure, and Germany, which is the country that has the most severe restriction against the use of the military in domestic policing, has also changed its policy quite a bit, and I'll just show you this in some data that gives you really an idea of this over time. Here, because I was speaking in Exeter, I kept Italy aside, but I only looked at we have data on France, Germany, and the UK. And here you can see the timeline of domestic military use. So when I find the first use of the military in domestic function, and here you can see that Germany is really the first one that started doing that. In the Hamburg flood in 1963, the Bundeswehr is deployed and is used to, in merely logistical functions. Oh, something I should probably also say is that I'm not giving a normative sort of judgment on how this is being done. It may very well be that domestic deployment is extremely benign and very unproblematic, but we do seem to find this variation over time. So Germany seems to really have quite, if you just focus on Germany for a moment, it started with the Hamburg flood in 1963, and then it continues. But if you look closely, you see how the types of the domestic deployment is very much merely logistical type of deployment, where you have, the Bundeswehr provides help at the G8 summit security. There is a flood, and then they provide relief. They do logistics and processing during the migration crisis, etc. In the case of France, things are a little bit different because France has a domestic deployment regulation, which is called Vigipirate, and that thing is introduced by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in 1978. But you don't see it in the data yet, because the military is not used until the early 90s, in 1992 to be more precise, during the terrorist attacks in Paris at Port-Royal and Saint-Michel. So that is the first time that the Vigipirate dispositif, that instrument, is used for the first time. But just so you know, the legislation exists since 1978. But if you look at France, you see how that, basically that type of employment is from the start very different from the one we have seen in Germany, right? So it's in France, the domestic deployment is really for military policing purposes. We have some of that in the 1990s, 92, then also again in 95, then again in 98, but the numbers are pretty small. Starting from 2015, however, here you see the big red crosses all the way there. Starting from 2015, with Operation Sentinel, François Hollande decides to deploy the military and domestic functions to a much greater extent in a way that we had never seen before. They deploy more than 10,000 soldiers, and for a very short time, those soldiers also gain judiciary police functions. So they have the same functions as police officers in the street. And this is really a new thing in French politics. In the UK, and this is really not a case I know very well, but I've been collecting a little bit of data on that just to get a sense of how it looked in the UK case. And here we have some really interesting, and much more varied type of deployment. So, the military has been, for the first time, used during the troubles in Northern Ireland, and then during the miners' strikes in the 80s, and then quite a lot in both, the UK seems to me, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong, seems to me a little bit of a mixture between French and Germany, where there is a lot of logistical sort of purpose in domestic deployments, and also a bit of things as we see them in France. So the military support was provided, for instance, after the London bombings. So that was just to give you a little bit of visual of how these erosions seem to look like. And then to continue to talk about that, I'll tell you a little bit more. Maybe we should also conclude on Italy, which is my other case that I really focus on, together with France and Germany. And in the case of Italy, we see a similar erosion. So Italy is a country that, because of its similarly to Germany, because of its fascist past, has had very strong provision against the use of the military domestically. But that started to change towards the end of the 1990s, where basically Berlusconi decided to launch this Operation Safe Road, which was used for the first time in an operation in Sicily, where basically the idea was that the army was supposed to show the presence of the state. It's called Operation Vespri Siciliani, and it's an operation that basically then paved the foundation for the continuation of this Operation Safe Road, and literally Operation Safe Road has done all sorts of things, ranging from collecting garbage in the streets of Naples to doing patrolling in the streets during heightened terrorist threat, particularly after the 2015 French terrorist attacks, etc. And interestingly, Operation Safe Road is still ongoing to this day. So the mission started in 1999. We are in 2025, and it has been 26 years that a domestic deployment operation has been deployed in Italy without ever getting, it basically gets renewed by Parliament every year without much discussion about the task and purposes for these army soldiers deployed, which is very surprising given the very strong norms that exist in Italy against the use of force, and the still quite strong, notwithstanding the current political climate, quite strong norms, anti-fascist norms that still reverberate strongly in society. So that's a kind of another interesting case to look at. The other sort of data, more quantitative data that I want to show to you, is based on COVID, and then just to confirm the main point that I'm trying to raise. Sorry, there is a typo there. There's an S too much. The main point that I'm trying to make here is that domestic deployment now is is the new normal, so to say, also in democracies. And so with Nick Dietrich and Christine Eck, we've published this paper that where we tried to look at, we basically collected data on the use of the military during COVID, and what we found was that most countries have actually used the military during COVID in very this slide that I want to show you, in very different functions, ranging from logistics to enforcement, border protection to intelligence to domestic protection and information provision. And the really, really interesting finding that was a little bit unexpected to us was that there doesn't seem to be a significant difference between domestic deployments in democracies and domestic deployments in autocracies, which suggests that again the norm against using the military in domestic functions in democracies seems to be quite eroded. Now, I would like now to turn to trying to figure out why that is the case. If you buy the fact that the norm does get eroded, and so in order to develop my argument, I'll move to try to basically explain how come that the norm has become eroded, and to do so, I focus only on France for a moment. Where together with Vincenzo Boven and Mauricio Rivera, we've been doing quite a bit of quantitative and I myself then continue to do more fine-grained qualitative work to try to understand how is it possible that Sentinel, that this domestic policing operation was possible and was put in place. And so the idea here is to try to. The thing that I'm trying to explain now is basically the centrality of domestic deployments in the case of France after the 2015 terrorist attacks. And so the locus that I was talking about at the beginning here is really that of civil-military relations, so this space at very much at the elite level, where we have decision makers that are taking decisions about domestic deployments, and high-level, usually military officers that are basically in charge of it, and they can position themselves in relation to this particular issue. And so in previous work, both with Vincenzo and Mauricio Rivera, and also with Christoph Harig, we've been working quite hard on trying to theorize about the push and pull of decision of doing domestic policing. And I would like to theorize further on this to try to really get at the micro foundation of how this works. So at the core of this, there is really the basically also very hierarchical relation between those that decide to authorize domestic policing and the militaries that actually have to do it. So they have to patrol their men and women in the streets to defend, to perform a wealth of different activities. So that is something that is usually called the civil-military problematique that Peter Fever defines in this particular way that I put up for you there in that quote. But the idea here is that different countries, different democracies may have developed different ideas of how to get that balance between getting military strong enough so that they can be effective, and civilians that are in control enough so that they know that they won't be overthrown by the military themselves. So the civil military paradox is something that occupies and it's very many democracies, and it's very much norms of domestic of domestic controls of the military lies at the heart also of a lot of what I'm talking about. But more importantly, I've been working quite a bit on what determines the equilibrium of power between civilian and military actors, and so that's really the work that I've done with Bove and Rivera. But what I find really interesting by reevaluating these cases is really that we find that in that work we find that an increase in terrorist threats or terrorist attacks increases non-violent military involvement in politics from its national baseline level. In our work, we have found that the theory suggests two mechanisms. Sometimes it's the military that absolutely wants to be more involved in politics, including in domestic policing. But it could also be that there is pulling by civilian decision makers for this. And so in that work that I cited in my earlier slide, that's what we are basically trying to work with. But what is really interesting for us here so in our previous work we argue that actors' motives are really important, but we also need an opportunity structure that shapes a civil-military relation equilibrium. So in our case, going back to my main argument for this book project, is that we need to have some kind of critical juncture where the norm is being used in a bit of a different way. So by looking at the case of France after the 2015 Bataclan and Stade de France and later 2016 Nice terrorist attacks, things change quite a bit, right? There is an urgent terrorist threat, an increased level and a much more visible level of terrorist threat in the country. And terrorism delivered its message beyond its immediate targets and victims, with, of course, significant psychological effect among the population. We argued in that previous work, that terrorist violence modifies the opportunity structure and facilitates state armed actors to become more increasingly involved in politics. But what is really interesting for this project that I'm talking about are these two mechanisms. So the fact that we may have the militaries that are pushing for eroding a particular norm and choosing a particular decision, and there may be pulling where government authorities demand military expertise to fight terrorism and strengthen national security, and in so doing they pull the military further into politics. So in that particular work we have tried to answer that question by looking at a global data set and then zooming in into particular case studies, which are Algeria and France. But the really important thing for us and that I would like to tell you about is the case of France, of the case of pooling in France. So in France in 2015-16, we have a pretty strong norm of civilian control, where we have pretty harmonious and consensual relations pretty consensual civil-military relations. When there is an increase in terrorist attacks and threats, with, as I said, Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan, Stade de France, and Nice, things start to change quite a bit. And so François Hollande declares that France is at war and deploys the largest military operation, the largest domestic military operation that was ever launched in France. So the president, François Hollande, pulls the military. He deployed 13 troops in Sentinelle, but it also starts with a set of institutional reforms that really increase the military involvement in politics. For instance, priorities given to the Defense Council over the Internal Security Council. There is also an increase in tactical autonomy for the military and contact with the presidency. And the military is given, at least for a short time, a judiciary police function, which is very interesting. Again, this is something we have never seen before in metropolitan France. Importantly here, high-level generals have remained skeptical. They've said that Hollande did that because he wanted to give himself a kind of strong, literally verbatim, a strong statement-like posture, and you know, the General Deportes sort of also declared very openly in the radio, saying the military component of Hollande's anti-terrorist measure is unnecessary and the war against terrorism will not be won through military means. So the French military was pretty explicit and vocal about the fact that for them that domestic policing operation was unnecessary and was even detrimental. But by and large, that operation was perceived to be was actually also quite advantageous for the military itself. What we know now is that it led to a very significant increase in recruitment. The military, particularly the army, became much more visible. So it was a really interesting, somehow unexpectedly gain for the French military. I thought I actually had done another slide. Clearly something is off here. But the really interesting thing also in relation to this is how to think about the different norms entrepreneurs and how they position themselves in relation to this. So clearly, if we talk about agents in the locus, in the space that are interested in dismantling the norm. In this particular case, we have François Hollande that couldn't care less about the norm and thought it was necessary to deploy to signal the presence and the strength of the state in such dramatic moment. And so he did that first. So he really can be characterized as the entrepreneur, and all the military in this particular case acted more as the norm protector. And time and again, they went on the media by saying that they basically thought that the norm that the military should be deployed only in opération extérieure, so in expeditionary operations. So taken together, this seems to suggest that there is something to be said about the importance at the micro level within the locus and the importance of these entrepreneurs that go out there and they make this strong case for in very exceptional times for dismantling the norm, and then little by little norms become ingrained and become inertial and becomes and then eventually it becomes hollowed out. In this particular case of terrorist threat in France after 2015, we see how there was an increased perceived threat that created this window of opportunity in which the norm was used in a different context, and then the agents carve out new interpretation of the norm. Just briefly, before I conclude, I just want to give you an illustration from the other case I'm thinking about, which is the case of searching and rescuing people at sea. So here the norm I'm looking at is the duty to rescue, which is a norm that has been accepted since very ancient times, and And the underlying idea here is that anybody, any human that is in trouble at sea should be saved. And the idea, that's something we find already in Virgil, for instance, the idea here is very much one of reciprocity. So, for instance, maybe Tony is drowning at sea, and I'm going to go and save him because I also implicitly know that he probably can come and save me should I be in equal trouble. So that's something that is very much enshrined also in a wealth of regulations, international law regulations that have formalized the norm of searching and rescuing people at sea, particularly Article 98 of the United Nations Convention, and also all the convention about the law, the safety of life at sea, and the Search and Rescue Convention. And so these that norm really has these three intertwined provisions. The first is the obligation of searching boats in distress, so the duty to search, bring them to the first place of safety is the second one. So bringing the people in distress to the first place of safety, and then rescuing people at sea is the third component of the norm. And so at the domestic level, we have a very, very, very precise type of institutionalization of this norm with very precise and detailed ways in which these norms will be implemented. So sea, throughout the world, globally is divided into search and rescue zones. And so once a signal of distress is launched and the appropriate ship is identified, that ship has to perform rescue and to bring the seafarer to the first place of safety. So this is the global maritime search and rescue system, and this is when it comes to the central Mediterranean route. This is how it looks like. So these are all the different parts that all the different search and rescue areas that are basically in place, so that if you find yourself with your boat in one of those areas, MRCC, a control center in the capital of each of these countries, will if you send a signal of distress of a nearby boat send a signal of distress, the MRCC will receive the distress call and will go out and try to look for you and try to save you. So the idea here is that starting from 2010, we definitely saw a perceived increased salience of the migration issue, and as I said at the beginning of my presentation, very much the idea that it was not a reciprocal idea of I save you because you're going to save me next, but was that different power relation that really kicked in, where several thousands, hundred thousands of migrants were crossing at sea, and they were portrayed to be pretty helpless in a way. So these were the discursive practices that really gained traction. And in practice, the search and rescue at sea entailed basically there were very many different actors involved at sea, ranging from humanitarian and governmental NGOs to fisheries, to merchant vessels, to smugglers, to the Italian Coast Guards, to Frontex and the Italian Navy. And by and large, the norm protectors were humanitarian NGOs and Coast Guards, particularly in Italy and in Malta. And there were instead politicians, including Matteo Salvini, who at the time was the Minister of Interior, that went out there and little by little started to dismantle the norm. His first question, and that had been done already by his predecessor, who was a centre-left ministry, Minniti. But Minniti and then Salvini both went to the press saying that the place of safety provision of the norm actually had to be reinterpreted, and that one could be in a place of safety even in a prison in Libya, which is something that is against the mainstream interpretation of the norm. But then Salvini went even further, he basically little by little started to also question other parts of the norm. So the humanization discourse started to kick in really starting from 2013, where little by little the entrepreneurs started to dismantle the norm by talking about the place of safety. As I said, the norm protectors started to fight back discursively by criticizing Salvini and many other principals, many other ministries, by even using examples from World War II. Admiral Petrino in 2018 became particularly famous for having done that in front of Italian authorities. During a pretty important celebration day, the 2nd of June, he talked about the 2nd of June is the celebration of all the armed forces in Italy, and Petrino basically talked about an Italian admiral who fought in World War II and fought against basically Nazi submarines and blew off submarines before doing SAR to save civilians. And by using that example, he was indirectly protecting the norm and trying to salvage the universality of the norm. Over time, what I seem to find is that the obligation of searching boats in distress, we clearly see a shift that starts immediately at the beginning of the migration crisis. But bringing migrants to the first place of safety is something that is the erosion of that part of the norm starts in 2013 with the realization that there is room for interpreting the norm in a different way, in a way that is useful for Northern Liga leader Salvini, as well as partly for the EU establishment. And then in a third step, the duty to rescue people at sea, something that is now daily questioned on a daily basis, to the point that, and that really starts from 2016, when Salvini pronounced a quite striking speech where he said that we should leave the migrants there, which is, and so I put up the image of a Trojan horse, because that's a little bit how it looks like. It looks a little bit like a Trojan horse, where by starting to hollow out the first provision of the norm, little by little, the entrepreneur found discursive space to be able to hollow out all the rest of the norm as well. This is this is very much still the case to these days. So by and large, I think I still have a few other slides that I've seen unable to. Okay. But this was basically the gist of the second component of the argument. I don't know where the rest of my presentation went, but it doesn't matter. So that was the core point. So just going back to my argument slide that I maybe can leave, and to my questions. So the argument that I tried to propose in my presentation is very much that when a norm is well anchored, it may become eroded when it's being applied in a different context, and I adopt a transnational polity-centered approach to try to trace the process through which it becomes eroded. And in the case of the norm of searching and rescue at sea, the kinds of narratives that I seem to find empirically are the humanization narratives that try to portray those that need to be saved as not worthy of being saved. And in the case of domestic deployments, I talk about normalization. So maybe I can just leave this up here, and I'm still exploring the possibility of doing other cases, but this is very much where I'm at. This is the kind of question I ask, is how norms get hollowed out, and in my presentation I basically try to sort of illustrate the workings of the argument. I think I can stop here, and I very much welcome any suggestions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chiara.